We're going to continue on with our story of Joseph this morning. I'm not sure how long the message will be, but we will take a look at what is happening in Joseph's life this morning. As you remember, Joseph had been with his brothers, or coming toward his brothers. They had tossed him into a pit, and out of the kindness of their hearts, they sold him into slavery and got rid of him and went back and told their father that he had died by being attacked by an animal. And then they said, "What's for lunch?" And let's move on. Now, Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had brought him from the Israelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer over his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and in field. And so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, there was no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." This morning we want to keep on looking into the life of Joseph. He's a very interesting character in the scriptures. One of the few people of whom there isn't really a lot of negatives that can be said about the life that he lived. He makes very good choices all throughout his life, in spite of the fact that he had had some problems. We have been looking at his family, at his father and his brothers, and a family situation that would just chill us to the bones if somebody would come to us in our families and talk about those kind of things. Maybe it's not that far away from us. Joyce and I have a relative of ours who is living in Prince Edward Island. His wife works at the University of PEI. She's got a PhD, and he's a health worker. They have two children. One is autistic, and the other is just a regular kid with regular problems. But as a couple, they struggled all throughout their life. And so about a year ago, she came to him and said, "I think it's time to end our marriage." Now, you have to understand the nature of PEI. There is no place where there is reasonable housing that can be found on the island. Everything is out of whack. And even with the opportunity to have good income coming into the family, they can't find a place for them to live. So the wife said, "Well, she'll live in the garage and have it all fixed up, and if the kids want to come and visit, then they have free access to visit and come back and visit." I'm sorry, I looked at that situation and I thought to myself, what a recipe for disaster is that's happening. We produce baggage or find baggage in our lives. We collect it in our lives, and it comes out of the situations that we go with. We don't create them, but they're there. Over the years, I've noticed, Joyce and I have noticed something very interesting about baggage. And that is that we never know how it's going to affect various people in the family. We've dealt with many families in all stages of grief and loss and shame and need. And it surprises us all the time, I think, when we look at the situation and look at the way that people come out of that situation and back into a normal flow of life. That is not always the people who we would think would survive and do well, that survive and do well. Sometimes it's the person who's received the worst of it. And we just look at that person and we say, how in the world are they going to succeed, and yet they do. This morning, we want to take a look at Joseph from a standard. We know that he came out of a situation that, to me, seems very damaged and problematic, and yet it seems that he was able to correct, able to stand up to all of these things. If anyone would have had a reason to give up, if anyone would have had a reason to say, this world is terrible, this world is not good, it would have been Joseph. And yet that he goes in the totally opposite direction. We want to continue his story from last week. Sometimes I think we look at the story of Joseph and we forget this is a 17-year-old boy who's out there trying to accomplish all sorts of things. His father, in a sense, provokes his brothers to hate him and to act against him. His father gives him a coat of many colors. His father tells all of the other boys in his family, this is going to be my heir. And the father has had Joseph report back on them and give them bad reports and all sorts of things. It seems as if Jacob goes out of his way to create conflict and trial and trouble in the lives of his family. It produces that, but it also takes things far too far. And it even takes those other sons to the point of murder. Now, somehow in the midst of all of that, and through conversations, they decide that it would be better not to murder him, but to sell him into slavery. And so they do. They sell him into slavery, and they receive 30 shekels of silver, which is about a month's wages for their brother. What a great way to do business, a cheap way to do business for both buyer and seller, but it's very expensive for the life that is taken away from freedom and forced into a lifetime of servitude. A lifetime in which you never really earn a wage because people don't have to pay a slave. A lifetime when there's no potential to work your way out of freedom because everything that you have can be taken away in an instant and nobody's going to say anything different. You can't work your way out of slavery. You can be granted slavery, you can be gifted slavery, but there's no pro quid quo. There's no way that you can get out of slavery unless the person who owns you decides to release you. Usually slaves were enemies that were captured in war, people that people hated right now. We can see the kind of tensions happening in Russia and the Ukraine as people get captured by one group and captured by another group, and it goes back and forth, and there's all sorts of animosity and hatred coming up. And then there's, because of the Balkans and those kind of things, then there's stuff that happened 100 years ago and 200 years ago and 500 years ago that still bother people and affect them, and they use every opportunity that they have to deal with them in a way that helps them with their own hatred. And when you have a war, one of the prizes of war is slaves. At least in the old days, it was slaves. That's what it's about. It's about taking what's not yours and making it yours without having to do the paying for it, the price for it, of looking after things. And so here we have Joseph, once the bright star of his family, at least in his father's eyes, is given away, is given to a caravan. Now, the scriptures kind of go that they're a caravan of Ishmaelites and a caravan of Midianites, two generally associated groups and probably intertwined with him. So it starts out that he's sold to the Midianites, but as he goes down to Egypt, he comes out of that time of travel actually in the company of Ishmaelites who go further. They go all the way to Egypt, and he's sold to an Egyptian by the name of Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was an interesting man for Joseph to be sold to. It seems as if he was in charge of the Pharaoh's political prison. His house was a jail. Joyce and I had the opportunity to look after young offenders for a number of years in a situation we call in Alberta open custody. So these were young men who had been convicted of crimes, and they were not old enough, or the crimes weren't serious enough for them to actually go into a jail or a youth facility. They would just be sent to our house. And it seems as if with political prisoners, at least in that day, if you were a political prisoner, you got sent to Potiphar's house. And so it's a place actually with two levels of jails. One level is for people of small crimes, and then in the deepest pit, in the deepest hole, it's a jail for political prisoners. Joseph is at first given the opportunity to be part of the group that is above those political prisoners. He's not above them in social rank. He's still a slave, and they're still free men. But he is above them in the fact that he has a lot more space to move in and to look around. So in a sense, Joseph starts off in minimum security. What happens with Joseph is he excels in the workplace. He's been put in charge. Don't forget, Joseph had been spending most of his adult life or teen life preparing for leadership, preparing for the leadership of the Jacob estates, the Jacob incorporation that he was going to inherit from his father when his father finally passed away. It was going to be his. And so he was getting all of the benefits of learning all of the things that you need to do, not to be a worker, but rather to be a manager or to be on top of things. So Joseph really fit well into that role. He's given an opportunity to allow his talents to show. And because he's promoted to management, it enables him to do these things with a lot of freedom. One of the things that we wanted to focus on is what does it take to make a godly person? What does it mean, and how do people change into a godly person? Well, a clue is found in this little passage. It's not a magic bullet, but it is wise advice. And really what Joseph is saying to us and pointing out to us is when you don't have choices, don't have many choices, make the ones that you have count. Joseph was not free to go out and walk wherever he wanted. He wasn't free to be able to spend money wherever he wanted. He wasn't free to become a businessman or to get married or to do any of the things that normal people do. He couldn't make those kind of choices, but it didn't mean he didn't have choices. And one of the choices that he had was that he could excel at the job that he had been given. And so he excelled at that job of being a manager. Unfortunately, Potiphar had a wife. I don't mean that he was bad because he had a wife. But I kind of, we're given a lot of room to play around with things sometimes when we're preaching. So I kind of wonder what the wife of a high official in Pharaoh's government might look like. Maybe she was a trophy wife. Maybe she was part of the team that everybody watched on TV, the Real Housewives of Cairo. You remember that show? No, you can't. You never saw that one. All right, well, that's the kind of woman that I think we have. She's more than likely one of the slaves that had come through Potiphar's house at some point in a while, and he made a gift of her to himself, a trophy wife. She was perhaps a little bit conceited because of that. And as time grew on, she developed less and less fear. No more fear, no more rules. She could control her husband. She knew how to turn the wheels to get Potiphar to do whatever he wanted. And under any other circumstances, for a 17-year-old country boy to all of a sudden have the opportunity to do some magic with a trophy wife kind of thing, it must have been tough for Joseph. It must have been hard on him. He's just a kid. He's had all of this responsibility, and if it's not responsibility that he's worried about, then all of a sudden he's got choices that he has to make that are perhaps too tempting for him. But again, Joseph decides to do something. He doesn't have a lot of choices. He can succumb to the wiles of this woman, and maybe she wanted to gain control of him so that she had the household all tied up. She had the owner of the house and the manager of the house. Everybody would be at her beck and call. And maybe she could use that as a wedge for her to even get higher. Whenever she needed it, she just had to go to Potiphar and say, by the way, you know what's happening, you're worthless and I don't care about you. But Joseph's note to her meant that he was placed under her manipulation. And her husband, she thought she knew how to manipulate him. When he came home, she said, see what the servant has done? And her husband just lost it. And he threw Joseph into a deeper and more dark part of the prison. And so all of a sudden Joseph goes from being in charge again to a place of darkness. And you've got to ask yourself the question, what would I do under those circumstances? How would I have reacted to that? More than likely, I would have said, God, you're not listening to me, you don't care about me, you don't want to hear my story, I don't have to believe in you, and I don't want to believe in you, and I'm just going to try and do the best that I can to get out of here because I don't care anymore. Those are thoughts, and I know they're human thoughts because I've had those thoughts before, and I'm sure you've had those thoughts before as well. If we're involved with sickness, if we're involved in some sort of financial problems, if we're involved in relational problems within our families, we sometimes get to the point where we say, God, I don't want you anymore. But not Joseph. Joseph chose, rather, to continue to honor God in spite of the circumstances that he found himself in. When Joseph gets down to the level of the political prisoners, he finds a lot of the freedoms that he had been taken away from him. When you get down to the level where Joseph was at, there's only two ways that you could leave that place of prison. And that is, one, that you would be pardoned, and two, that you would be assassinated. Were the only two ways out of that prison. And Joseph finds himself at that level. And he could have given up. He had every right to give up. But he decides, rather, to use what God has given to him. And that is the gift of understanding and interpreting dreams. Remember the dreams that he had when he was with his brothers? The dreams of the sheaves of wheat, the dreams of the stars and the sun, and all of those kind of things. Joseph had dreams going through his life all the time, and God had given him a gift of being able to understand and interpret them. And so when the two men who were there with him in prison, one was the cupbearer and one was the head baker of the Pharaoh, two very important, two very high posts. When he finds these men having dreams, he looks at them and he says, I know the reason why you've had these dreams, and this is what they mean. And they go on to be successfully interpreted by these men. In a short time, these men have been taken away and released. One was released, He was pardoned, and the other was assassinated, and he died. And 3 days later, and then it takes 2 years after that for Joseph to come back and receive from God another chance, another way out of his freedom. I wanted us to focus this morning specifically on what we do with things. The number one thing is that we all have baggage. How do you deal with the baggage in your life? For most of us, we come to terms with it. We come to the point where we say, you know what, things may have been bad when I was growing up, but they were just as bad for almost everybody else that I know. There are very few families, there are very few young people that come out of their homes and say, that was wonderful, that was great. We had 2 children, 2 boys. Our oldest, Steve, said, you guys did the best parenting job in the world. Everything you did was 100% good. And our other child said, you didn't love me, you didn't care about me. And we did exactly the same thing with both of them. So you never know. You never know. But God gives us freedom. God gives us choice. That's one of the things that we have as a human being. And you may not get exactly what you choose, but you have to understand that what God wants to see in you is a willingness to receive from Him what He has given to you to receive, to use your freedom for good, to use your freedom to help other people through sin. May the Lord bless His word to us this morning. It's time for a communion.